Very good. So we are on week 3 of our discussion of this book, The 5 Invitations by Frank Ostaseski, and our discussion in general about death and what it teaches us about life. And if I am recalling correctly from last time, we had a request for 2 topics to be discussed this week. One is metta, and the other one, I remember a request for the 4 elements, but then I couldn't remember. Was there also one more request that came from you, Michaela?
Yes.
Or was it the 4?
Euthanasia.
The euthanasia topic. Yeah. Okay, great. Great. Okay. Well, so we have our work cut out for us in this, and perhaps we'll see how we can tie this back in to the reading here. So let me suggest that we'll start with the metta topic, and then we can discuss euthanasia of animals in particular, and next. So metta. Aha! Who's that cutie?
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. That's Billy.
That's Billy. Hello, Billy.
Billy
That's great.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, maybe we'll have one day where have everyone bring their pets. You know? John Renwick shared his dog with us last time. I don't know where John is. Yeah. In any event, okay, so metta, usually often translated as loving kindness, or Bhante Gunaratana of Sri Lankan descent, and very well-known book called Loving Kindness in Plain English, following on his Buddhism in Plain English, or Mindfulness in Plain English. He's got a bunch of them. Bhanteji likes to call it loving friendliness. And metta is one of the 4 Brahma viharas, or you could translate. So vihara is an abode or a dwelling. That's what we call the monasteries often in Theravada tradition, but it's also understood to be an abode or a dwelling of the mind, not just the body. And Brahma, something heavenly or divine or sublime, like in that area. So the 4 are metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. And so that's loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic, or it often translated as sympathetic joy, but actually better is empathetic joy.
Empathetic.
Yeah. And equanimity. And you had a link to a sutta in which the Buddha gives what we understand to be some meditation instruction of the 4 Brahma viharas. And he says, it says, one who abides, pervading 1/4 of the world, 1/4 of all things, with a mind imbued with metta, and then the 2nd quarter, the 3rd quarter, the 4th quarter, above and below, and abundant, exalted, immeasurable form of mind, being, state of mind, state of being, that is understood to be what we often call the radiating form of metta. So I might share with you some other links to some guided meditations on it, but oftentimes the way that it's done is invoking an image or an image or some kind of thought of something that brings that feeling of kindness, of wanting the well-being of something or someone, and having that feeling then kind of get centered in the heart center area, not necessarily the literal physical heart, but the heart center area. And then using this idea of quarters and spreading it around, so to speak, that energy. Or letting it radiate out rather than spreading it actively. Spreading it actively works, can work, but it can also create some kind of tension for folks. And the idea being touching into, it's not so let me just say one other thing, which is the other form of metta, which is also very common, and actually the first form of metta that I started practicing when I started doing metta back about 15 years ago, is the recitation form. So you have a series of statements like, may all beings be well, and may all beings be safe and at ease, may all beings be happy and free from mental and physical suffering, and may all beings be at peace and liberated, something like that. There are different formulations of the recitation, and people can, and lots of folks actually make up their own. So those are the two main forms of practicing metta and all the four Brahma Viharas. And just to say, the key aspect I've come to learn after all these years of doing it, one very important way of grounding yourself in metta is to understand that it's, even if you're saying those statements, whether you're saying those statements or you're doing this kind of radiating the energy of it, the sense of it from you out into the world, the intention is, the idea is not to be necessarily changing the world. It's not to actually make the world look like that thing. It's the idea of it is to touch into that own aspect, that aspect of your own intention, that aspect of your own being, your own mental and physical experience, and to bring that to mind over and over again in such a way that it can begin to grow and it can begin to inform the rest of your life. And what we see oftentimes in the Mahayana is that one way of thinking about invoking this quality is related to Kuan Yin, or Kanon, or Kanzeon, or Avalokiteshvara, whatever name you like to use for them, her, she, he, it, they. Right, to make this embodiment of that quality. So I would say Kuan Yin is usually described as the Bodhisattva of compassion, and compassion is the second of the Brahma Vihara. So first is metta, which is loving kindness, wishing the well-being of all beings, self and all others, and animals and spirit beings, whatever, nagas, whatever you are interested in. And the second one is karuna, or compassion, and karuna is understood to be another facet, or perhaps looking at it from the other side, if you will, of wishing beings to be free from harm. So one side is the positive, may they be well, and the other side is the not the removal, but the absence of the negative. May they be free from harm, may they not have harm in their life, or intention to harm aimed at them or generated in them. That's how so usually when we talk about kanon in the sense of compassion, and yet the way that it's taught and the way that it's understood is actually, to my mind, both of those two. It is both metta and karuna in this one you know, putting a face on it, if you will, putting an embodiment on it, seeing it as a being that then has an efficacy. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for some conversation or comments or questions.
Since you've just had a visit with Bhante Sujato, he has a wonderful, I don't know if I'd call it a course. I think it was probably over maybe a Rains retreat. He gave a series of talks walking people through how his teacher had taught him. It's an amazing course. I'm not too sure how I access it, perhaps on the Santi website, but it's a,
Okay.
I highly recommend that series, probably a series of around 10 talks, just moving you through this particular meta training that he had that he really likes. And yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had not heard of that.
Can you find that and post it? Can you find that and post it for us?
Okay, I will. Yeah, because I have a reference to it on my website, so I can get it from my website if I can't find it on his.
Great. Thank
you.
And then put it on the forum. That's lovely. Thank you, Sanghamita.
If I can get in. If not, I'll send it to I'll send it to you, and you can put it on.
Sure. If you can't get logged in, that's fine. Yeah. What else? Other thoughts? Yes, Vanessa?
About what you were talking with the karuna, and with the death of my cat, it seemed I was highly motivated that he would get better, and I'm wondering if it can be too much maybe, and that I should have just let him go without I was giving him medicine and massaging him, and just it was coming from the loving kindness and wishing him to be well, but it didn't. Not.
Yeah, I mean, I think this again is pointing toward what I was saying earlier. So I don't think that the practice of compassion or karuna is inviting us to not do the things that we can to alleviate suffering in the world. I think that is great. We do need to do what we can to alleviate suffering in the world. And we also need to be realistic that the world is never going to be completely free from suffering. That's not the kind of world that we live in. We ourselves,
break the First Noble Truth.
Yeah. We ourselves can become free of suffering through our practice. That's another matter, right? But to say that the world would stop demonstrating both suffering and the absence of suffering, that's not going to actually come to fruition. So I, and maybe this also goes into the euthanasia discussion, but our ability to gauge what is going to be helpful is somewhat limited. We have to do what we can, and then we have to look at the results, and we have to investigate our motivation and see how all that turns out, and then take the next step. And the practice is again more focused on touching into our own intention not to create harm in the world, for example, or to alleviate suffering when we can, as an example, using karuna. And to continue to foster that and grow that. And in that process, perhaps our discernment gets better and better. Our discernment becomes more clear. Our ability to open our eyes and actually see what's happening becomes more clear. But it's not always going to be perfect, right? So this is another reason why we practice in community, so that we have some help, some mirroring from other people who also perhaps have a shared intention around this and can help give us some feedback about how we're doing.
I listened to a lovely Dhamma talk by Ajahn Brahm on this topic with animals. And well, and not just animals, he said the same thing could be for if you had a loved one who was dying and was hooked up to all kinds of machinery, and you know, the question is, do you unhook or not unhook? And he said, just sit beside, you know, his suggestion was sit beside your cat or your dog or your mother or father, like whoever it was that was in this position. So, you know, to sit beside, say, thinking about your cat, and you were giving, you know, all this medicine and wondering, should you be prolonging the life of your cat? And he said, just in your mind, ask the question to the cat, do you know, like, do you want me to keep giving you this medicine or whatever? And then just be quiet and listen with your heart. And I mean, I've never put this into practice because I haven't had a pet for the last over 50 years since I was a kid at home. But so I can't give any personal experience, but this is what he said, just to sit quietly, ask the question to your pet or your loved one in your mind, and then just be quiet and listen with your heart. And he said, you'll get an answer. Yeah, whether to,
maybe,
yeah,
you might get an answer.
But I have no personal experience, but it just seemed like, well, it seemed like a bit of a relief, because you're not, I guess, and he was saying this in his talk as well, that you don't have to be making the decision, you know, it's like you're sort of energetically asking the person or the pet, and you're not having to take all the responsibility for the action, you know, for the decision yourself.
Yeah, I don't know about that reasoning. And I would also say, having been in many situations with family members like that, I can say many times people don't get an answer. People can sit and ask and wonder and reflect, and or not ask and not wonder and not reflect, or try many different things and agonize over these decisions because they're not getting an answer.
Okay.
So I think that's a kind of idealized way of thinking about what people go through in those situations. And certainly to say that you are not taking full responsibility for that action, I mean, you know, unless you're getting some input from other folks, you know, like the doctors or other folks, okay, then you could say there's some sharing of how that action comes to take place, or who actually does the turning of the button and so on. But, you know, karma, right? Intentional body, speech, and thought. So if it's done with intention and not accidentally hitting the button or pulling that person's tube, that's a karmic act. But maybe, Michaela, you want to say something about your rabbits and your thoughts about pets in particular.
Yeah, actually more stories, but I think I will mention only one. Well, I wish to actually ask everyone what do you think about that, also from the perspective of precepts, because in general I tend to like say no to euthanasia, but I still can imagine some situations when I would agree with that and rather maybe break the precept. So, and one of them is, for example, one of my friends had a dog who had cancer, and during his last days he couldn't control his tongue at all. So he couldn't drink and eat, and he wasn't even happy to see them. So and it was like terrible pain, you know, this is a very painful way actually to die. And I think in that case it would be too extreme maybe. like euthanize. Maybe I would rather say like, yeah. But it's really difficult because I saw many animals that looked like they were going to die, but they didn't. Or also animals that would deserve like natural death, because some pain is like natural, of course, and very often we euthanize because of our pain, not the pain of the animal, because we cannot look at it. Yeah. Yeah. And one of those stories, it was a couple of years ago, and the dog, she was lucky, but I almost decided to to kill her, let's say.
Yes.
I cannot pronounce it, euthanize.
Yes.
And it was when we lived at Milan's house, they had a small dog, and she was getting old. And one day she stopped eating, and she was getting weaker and weaker. And Milan's mom asked me to call vet because it was quite clear that she started to die, basically. And at the time, I wasn't thinking about that too much, so I agreed. It was usually what I saw around myself, that like the animal is weaker, you think that she's in pain, so you call your vet. And he agreed to come, check on her, and give her the injection. Yeah, but the day he should come. Yeah, he called us the other day. The other day I called him, and he was supposed to come the other day. But the day he called us that he's busy. Yeah, that he can come the next day. And she died natural over that night. And I was just and I was like, I wasn't really thinking about it, but I was sort of shocked because I was like, what were you doing? Like, you weren't thinking about it? And when I think about it right now, she wasn't in extreme pain. It was just part of the dying process. She has a very nice natural death, I think. So I think this was the first event that made me think about it much more.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your statement there, you know, that oftentimes when these kinds of questions are invoked, it has a lot more to do with the discomfort and the pain and the confusion of the folks who are sitting there observing than it has to do with the situation of the person who's or animal who's in the dying process, you know. It costs, and there are, as I think you've also alluded to, I think there are situations where it is the compassionate thing to do. I think, I mean, in one specific instance I recall in the hospital, there was a young man, very young guy, like he had just, he had his 21st birthday, and to celebrate his 21st birthday, he took some pills. He was just like gonna have some, you know, get high kind of fun. And he apparently took too many of these pills. Like he took 3 of something he was only supposed to take 1 of. And he came into the hospital basically brain dead. And he was in the intensive care unit for many days, like 5 or 6 days. And then, you know, trying to flush everything out of his system and get, you know, his lungs working again and trying all sorts of things. And they did manage, actually. I mean, they have machines that will breathe for you. So they had him on, they were breathing for him, as they say, in the hospital, politely, to try to tell people, not to tell people that your, you know, loved ones stopped breathing. They were breathing for him, and he still had a heartbeat. And so the family had a very, very difficult time kind of understanding like what to do. They felt they were really paralyzed in their own thinking about what to do, you know, because he looked like he was just asleep. But all the neurology folks were just like, no, there's not a person there anymore. He's gone. That person that you knew, that his mind is totally stopped functioning. And And so they said, okay, you know, after like at the end of the week, basically a week went by, and at the end of the week they said, okay, you know, we don't know what else to do, and it seems like you don't know what else to do, and so we don't want this, you know, him to be lying here like this forever, because there seems no reasonable end to that anytime soon, right? It's a young, very young body. And so they agreed to have to unplug him. And then what happened was that the organ donation folks came.
Yes.
And they wanted to talk to the family because, you know, here's this young, very healthy young man up until this moment of doing this, making this mistake. And it was a Hispanic family, so I was very involved in this conversation much more than I ordinarily would be, because I was helping to do some translation and such. And anyway, we sat down with the organ donation folks and with the physician and the family. And then the organ donation folks started saying, well, you know, we could probably get his kidney functioning again, or we could probably get his, you know, his liver functioning again, and maybe we could use that as a transplant for someone. And they were like, are you saying that you could make it work? You know, like bring him back? They were totally stunned by this conversation, right? Because of their understanding of what had happened to him. So it's a very complex, you know, in the end, they did give the organs, but they waited like another several days of having him put back on the machines, having the body put back on the machines, and think about it and try to, again, wrap their minds around what had happened to this person and that this person was really gone. So it's a very, very confusing, you know, confusing process that we go through when someone dies in our life. It can be. And having to make decisions around that, it's very subtle, you know, it's very subtle. And it happens more and more, you know, because of that, because we can get somebody's heart started again, or we can get somebody's breathing going, or we can do things that we weren't able to do, you know, 100 years ago or something. So, yeah, I mean, these are the situations that happen. We need to be prepared. And I think to that point, I want to say, I think Frank does a very nice job of talking about precisely this phenomena in this particular invitation, right? Bring your whole self, right? Be willing to be there by the bedside, feeling that helplessness, feeling that fear, feeling that confusion, feeling whatever it is that's going on there, right? And not trying to distance yourself from it or fix it by doing something or not doing something, but really, really bringing that whole experience into awareness, conscious awareness, with enough clarity that you can then meet whatever's happening for that person who's dying or who's dead. Genku, did you want to add something? Oh, you took yourself off mute.
Yeah, I really appreciated this invitation as well, and a couple of things that came up for me, maybe one for now, was that it reminds me of something my teacher likes to say, Tenshin Roshi, that your life doesn't have to look like anything. And for a long time, I didn't understand what he meant by that. The idea is it doesn't have to look the way other people expect it to look. And the same thing comes when it comes to grieving. It's the same thing. And Frank has a nice section in there where he says, you know, it can take so many forms. And there's a tendency sometimes for people to have a certain set of expectations about what grieving is supposed to look like. And that usually doesn't work. That things can be very different. And I've seen that in my own life, people going sometimes being very surprised at the way grieving worked out for them. It's there's a lot of range there.
Yes.
From very vocal, very expressive, very involved in big floods of lots of things, to none of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that recently in my partner when, in fact, when his mom died suddenly. Well, he hadn't been here in the United States for very long and was unable to go back to the green card stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The way immigration works. And there, I saw no tears. I kept thinking, well, eventually we'll come to that place where we'll see some emotional outpouring, and there never was any. At one point I had a photograph of his mom, and I put it on the altar, and he walked by and said, "No, I'd rather you didn't." I thought, well, that was really odd. And I thought, well, am I learning something odd about this person that I didn't know before? Is this something I should be concerned about? And I later found that he's completely capable of a full range of emotional expression, but at that time, that was how he had to deal with that.
Yes.
It seemed to work for him. And I'm still a bit puzzled and surprised by that, but at the time, just kind of giving him the space to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So watching and waiting, I guess, to see what would happen. And that's how that was. I'm still a bit surprised by it.
Mm. So you gave him a gift, really, right? Of not imposing on him your own idea of what it was, and you just gave him some room.
I was kind of waiting to see, and I just ended up just waiting and watching.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to be okay for him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And just to call out that, as you said, I mean, talk about a range of experiences. Everything from, I've seen like immediate fury, you know, to just that, a kind of very cool, very quiet response, a very withdrawn response, which I consider to be slightly different than the cool, quiet. Then there's the, you know, so more typical, like the crying and sometimes all the above, right? I mean, you really, really have to leave a lot of room for that.
Well, and for me, I remember Frank mentions Elizabeth Kubler-Ross early on in this thing, and we probably all heard about her stages of grief. I'm always a little suspicious of these kind of, this stage followed by this. It sets up a series of expectations that across the board, when I see that kind of thinking, sort of, sometimes it's useful and helpful, I guess, to say, okay, well, these are the ways it can happen, but I'm not so sure it's always a sequence in the way that's laid out. I don't know if others find that that's the case, but folks who've had more experience with this kind of thing, if that's always true, or if there's a lot of variation, as you say. It's when things come up, right?
Yes, when things come up and whether they come up, frankly, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see I know folks, and this is something that's true of my partner. I don't see a lot of this denial stuff. No, it's a thing that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Life is a part of the package. I remember we had a dog, quite an elderly dog, who had it's something myelopathy. It's a neurological disorder that large dogs often get, and the back end of the dog stops working eventually.
Yes.
The dog isn't able to move, and if you have a great big dog, that becomes a great big problem for both the dog and for you. I remember him saying for the longest time, he had great affection for this hound dog, saying, you know, she's going to die pretty soon. Might want to be ready for that. Very matter of fact. Maybe that comes from growing up in a small Chinese village where you're surrounded with both life and death and all of its aspects. Very raw. Sometimes we're a bit more insulated from that.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes Ayya Dhammadipa, my sister here at the monastery, she grew up in Wales, in a very small town in Wales. And she said it was more like that there were always, not always as in any given moment, but generally speaking, there's someone dying and there are people being born and there's everybody in stages in between, and the animals are also going through all that, and it was always kind of close in because everybody's close in. It's that small of a a town, and that small, that kind of knowing the person was real, right? You know, from the beginning when you were a kid, and that had a different feeling to it than certainly than like myself, who I never experienced any death at all until my grandfather died when I was 18. And even then, you know, I was out of the country at the time, so I really had no sense of what he'd gone through till I flew back for the funeral. Sangeeta, did you want to say something?
Oh, just making a comment about Kubler-Ross. When my father was dying, I remember I had gone home to visit, spend some time with him, and was spending a lot of time just sitting in the bedroom while he would doze, or, you know, I don't remember. It's a long time ago, so I don't remember all the details. But I was very aware of Kubler-Ross's, you know, stages. So I thought, well, I should help my father or do something. And I remember initiating a conversation about this, and it became pretty clear to me pretty fast that he was totally uninterested. And so I just dropped it, went back to mostly sitting in silence with him. So anyway, that, you know, that's my only experience with her. Didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, let's see. So can we remember her stages? So the first one is denial, and the second one is bargaining, and the third one is anger. Is that right?
Anger, yeah.
And then the fourth one is when sadness starts to happen.
Sadness, depression,
and then there's a fifth, I think, but I can't recall
acceptance.
Acceptance, of course, because finally you get there sooner or later. Yeah, and for some people it can take decades, you know, that there's a sort of unrealized grief, and then some other thing happens, you know, you lose a friend, or there's some tragedy. I know that like the 9/11, when the 9/11 happened, or whenever there's a, you know, huge earthquake or a hurricane in someone's home country, then inevitably that would spark also some feelings sometimes for folks who had grief about previous deaths that they still weren't quite done with, you know, or we're still processing through it, even much, much, much later. So we need to be prepared for grief to be with us as well.
It pops up at funny times sometimes.
It pops up at odd times.
I had a dear friend who had cancer for the longest time, and, you know, he survived a couple of real bad bouts. And the third one, it was very clear to everyone, and him included, that this was going to be the last one. So everyone had a long time to prepare for this, and his partner as well was, you know, kind of went through the stages early along with him. They all accepted this fact that he was not going to be around. And I remember it was 2 years later, and we all, you know, at various times we had real nice farewell parties, and there was crying, and there was laughter, and all the good stuff. I believe it was 2 years later, driving through his parents' old hometown of Colton one day. I just the sight of that road sign, Colton, and knowing that his parents and his family was there, and I cried for about 4 exits down the 60 freeway, or the 405. It's just, wow. And I was like, where did that come from? That was interesting. Really stored that up someplace in a little storehouse waiting to get expressed. That was a funny thing.
Yeah, interesting. It's true. We don't know, and then some trigger happens, and
well, I cry at commercials on airplanes. You know?
Yeah, I mean, so far we've heard a lot about your crying during this 3 weeks.
I do a lot of that,
so far.
Been doing a lot of that lately.
I'm appreciating it, I have to say. I'm getting a soft spot for your crying stories.
Lots of them.
Margaret, you had your hand up?
Yes, I did. The whole question of euthanasia the image of the cat that we have had here on the screen. I have been thinking with reading this that for many of us, our first experiences of death are with pets. And it happens, it may not be a euthanasia. It may be the cat that's hit by the car or the dog that's hit by the car. But then as we become older and more responsible, the time comes when the decision that agonizing is more care appropriate. Am I keeping the animal alive because I can't let go? If I left things alone, what would, and the turmoil that this is and the self-questioning, and I have made the decision, and in retrospect, not always wisely, and in some cases to end what was unquestionable suffering. And none of it was right, and all of it was right at that moment. And I have had the good fortune of being able just to hold an animal and have it breathe its last. But I've also had the misfortune of going down to the kitchen every morning and praying that it would have happened overnight, and it didn't. And then at what point is there no dignity, no quality of life, no ability to eat? And once I began to practice, it was more watching very carefully the eyes of the creature and what could it tell me when had it given up, and was it appropriate to intervene, or was I intervening in a process that exists for animals exactly as it exists for us, because we're also animals? Is there a spiritual process that's happening? There are just so many questions of so many different levels and complexities.
Yes.
And it can spur guilt, it can spur grief, it can spur relief. I mean, it just covers the gamut.
Yes.
But it's very easy to bring all those memories back and trigger all those feelings again. And we're not talking about human beings. We don't have the option of euthanasia with human beings, except in terms of removing treatment. But we have the same agonizing, if only it would end, or should we do more, or should we stop? There aren't any answers, just what's best.
Yes.
I think doing the best you can at the time with who you are, what the situation is, and what the law allows.
Yeah, I mean, that was when I worked with the palliative care team in the hospital. That was one of the things that they very clearly advocated for, was to say sometimes you can make a decision to stop certain kinds of care, knowing that that will have consequences and that will naturally lead to this person's death in a certain amount of time, which is unknown, but you know, within some scale can be foreseen. And could we be okay with that? Could we see that as a compassionate outcome? And just as you say, every case is different. Every case has its regrets and its relief and all the things in between.
Yeah, they told me to euthanize him. He had an episode. He had a heart problem. He was very young, and so he had an episode in January, and they told me to euthanize him, and I decided not to. And I was able to give him medication, and he had a wonderful life. He was happy and running around, and I had to give him medication every day. But and so this last episode that he had, they told me again that I really should euthanize him, and I didn't accept it. I thought, no, he was able to get through this before, and I brought him home, and I really wish I would have done that. I asked him, sat quietly, and instead I was so motivated. and even I saw that he was going, and I saw in his body how like it just, and I have a lot of guilt that I didn't just sit with him quietly and was so motivated by my own maybe desire for him to live.
Yes, yes. Well,
Don't beat yourself up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's just to me, I hear what I hear is you loved him, you cared for him,
Yes.
you did your best in that context, and you also see some gap between that and your ideal. And as some folks know here, practice is going to show you the gap between your ideal and your actions over and over again. And that can either be something that inspires you and lifts you up, or you can let it become something that harms you and tears you down. So I hope that you don't take that latter road and that you let it be the other way.
Can also teach you.
Yeah. Yes, Michaela.
Oh, maybe it's a good time for bunnies because it relates to the cat story. Actually, I found a good vet who told me once, I have two bunnies who are very ill. They had like maybe 2 lethal diseases. One of them was lethal like 100%, another one they didn't know. And I found a good doctor who, actually I didn't need to make a decision this time because he's very careful about recommending killing the animal, and this time he didn't, because he always says that as long as the animal has at least one thing that they're happy about, it can be food, it can be your presence, then you shouldn't do that. So I listened to him, and I agree basically.
Yeah.
There are some extreme cases, but in like 90% of cases, I would say that's a pretty good criteria. Let's say after, of course, we also have to reflect on what we feel about it and so on. But even when we're sort of like 99% sure that we're not making a decision based on our own pain, it's still difficult. And then I think this criteria is pretty good. And to be with the bunnies, it should to be a really good advice because they survived and now they're healthy. Like,
do you want to show us one of the bunnies?
She's jumping on my bed, one of them.
We're gonna have bunny display today. We're gonna have it's pet day. There we go. There.
Oh, look at this rabbit. Oh my.
Yeah, the only consequence is that she cannot close one of her eyes.
Oh.
She's not bad.
She's such a big girl. I didn't realize she was that big, actually.
Very
I've seen
large
photos.
bunny.
No, like that. And the other one, yeah, they're a pair. They're a bonded pair.
There are two of these critters.
Oh, here she comes. Oh, no,
my.
this one's a male, I think, right?
Oh, they're both girls.
They're both girls.
My.
Oh, look at her. Hello.
So, with the old, the decision about the old animals, it's a little bit different when compared to deciding about young animals that may be really ill, may have various diseases, but I think we should take care of them too. And
Yes.
But it's difficult. I had moments when I thought that I was torturing them, basically. Like I wasn't doing any invasive treatment. It was just supportive treatment. And even in that case, it's difficult. Yeah, you're thinking whether you're making maybe the process longer for them, but they wanted to eat, so yeah.
We see that part. They clearly wanted to eat.
Yeah, they're very happy about food. So.
Yes. Yeah. So ways of addressing our own discomfort in the moment, right? So sitting quietly, reflecting on how that being might be thinking about wanting or not wanting to be alive, looking in their eyes, seeing if they eat, if they enjoy your presence, You know, it's funny that some folks think of the difference between how we deal with the death of pets or farm animals or other animals as being so different from human beings. But again, it's sometimes people are in that same situation of not being able to tell us directly what they want or how they feel or whether they feel or whether it's time or not time. So really learning to listen to what's happening for ourselves, but also to do some real close listening to what we see in that person. I think Frank also talks about that in the book, talking someone through on the phone, how to observe her mom's more subtle cues.
Yeah.
Yes, Margaret.
I had an experience many years ago with a Siamese cat. The cat was at least my husband's and my IQ. And by the time, I'm not kidding. And as he got to be quite elderly and his kidneys were failing and he clearly was dying, I sat with him one day and I just sobbed. And I was talking to myself, how much I was going to miss him and all that. And suddenly he raised his head, looked me in the eye, and into my head came the words, "Why are you so distressed? This is normal. This is natural." Now, I would have said, "Why are you so upset?" So "why are you so distressed" was not my vocabulary. And it was as if he was communicating clearly to me. And the minute I responded with, "Because I'm going to miss you," then he looked away. He wasn't going to deal with this silly thing anymore. But it was so vivid to me that he communicated to me what I did not want to hear, but what I remember to this day, and which was valid, absolutely valid. So they're amazing. You never know what they can do.
So you did get a message, right? You did get some kind of clear indication. So
absolutely.
Now, and was that a relief to you, Margaret?
Ultimately, we did euthanize, but only because the last night he was with us, instead of confining him in an area, I gave him free rein of the house, and he came into bed and couldn't get comfortable. All night long, could not get comfortable. And to me, that was such a clear message that this was not okay, that nothing was working, and we did euthanize. And it was a relief because we had to leave to go somewhere, and I was going to not go. I cried for 2 years over that cat.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was our first child.
Yeah.
Yeah, my Dharma brother, Julian Dyson Orr, who hangs out at Green Gulch running a tractor when he can, has had dogs and cats and gone through recently the loss of some dogs and some cats. And he said to me something I thought was interesting. He said, when we bring an animal companion, a pet, into our lives, we're making a contract
Absolutely.
to keep them going and to be there for them.
Yes.
And maybe make the decision for them that it's time to go. And it's part of the package.
Yes.
And I'm watching him, you know, he said, "No, I'm done with cats. I'm done with dogs." Then, okay, I watch the clock. About 6 months later, there's a kitty cat showing up in the house again. So that happens.
Well, I'll say
Margaret made a point that I thought was so important for me, and that is that you don't know that you're getting it right all the time with pets, or with anyone else for that matter. And I think I know I beat myself up about the loss of a dog that had this the inability to use her hind legs, and the dog would look at me sometimes and say, "I am in great discomfort," but it's not that the dog was hurting. The dog was incontinent, the dog couldn't get up to pee or poop, and the dog weighed 100 pounds and was very difficult to move. And the vet just told me, "It's time, you need to bring this dog in." And I still second guess that decision to me today. Was that the right moment? Couldn't I have done something else for a few more weeks?
Yes.
And I don't know the answer.
Yes.
And I have to be comfortable with not knowing that.
Yes, I've euthanized one cat, and that I'm not sure that is the right
Yeah, I'm
term.
not sure. I'm really
You
not
know,
sure.
I really don't. But
I just am not sure.
go ahead, Margaret, and then I'm gonna.
I was going to say, this is where that line, not knowing is most intimate,
Yes.
is so true.
Yes.
Because these situations are so intimate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They don't get any more intimate. And
Yes.
with human beings too.
Yes. So it means intimate in the mundane sense, as in we are right there.
Yes.
You know, we are right there in the physical presence of death and this being and that process. And it also means intimate in the wisdom sense, right? That when we truly acknowledge our not knowing, that is a reflection of reality. That is us actually taking a step closer to the acceptance of the reality of the human experience. We don't know. We
I
don't
think
know.
it's totally broken open that feeling of insecurity of where he is and my own work, and it's
Yes.
really intense. And I've been going through I not being able to sleep because of the ungroundedness of everything, and like in Pema Chodron's book about ungroundedness, that it really is that way, that there really is no ground, and that's very scary.
Yes. Well, and staying with that, right, with all those feelings of fear and confusion and opening, right, all staying with all of that is ultimately good practice, is ultimately steps on the path of coming to a lived experience of impermanence, which the Buddha said was one of the highest, in fact, he said it higher even than metta practice in terms of its efficacy in our path toward liberation, is to have a deeply visceral lived experience of impermanence. And the other thing I want to say that the Buddha, to throw in a little bit more sutta for you, is to this question of intention versus impact. So the Buddha was talking to his son Rahula, who had gone forth as a monk at that point in his life, and he said, Rahula, when you do anything with intention, as in when you create kamma, when you do something in your life, then you want to think about what the impact of that will be before you do the thing, and then, or say the thing, or do any kind of karmic activity, think the thing. You want to reflect on what you think the consequence will be and be clear about that. And then when you're doing the thing, you want to think about what the consequences are that are happening, what's actually there, what's actually really the impact that happens, and your intention, and be clear, he said also in both cases, about the intention, the motivation that's related to that, because that's also important, that's also a factor in the karmic consequence of anything. And to reflect yet again after on what the result was, what the consequence was, what your intention was, what your motivation was. So the Buddha really says that both intention and impact matter. I think it's many of us tend to fall over to one side or the other of that equation, and really want to let one rule over the other. You know, what I intended is much more important than the way you experienced it, for example. I've heard that argument many times, that's an argument that tends to, in fact, that tends to really inflame the sensibilities of folks who are at the tail end of discrimination, for example. Right?
Right. Yes.
Right. Yes. And consequences without any context of intention, just looking at situations like that, I think it can be very cruel. It can be a way of sort of ignoring our human frailty, our human tendency to error, with the Buddha called the vipalasas, our distortions of perception. We don't see things absolutely clearly. So both things, we should reflect on both of those things before, during, and after. So we have maybe about 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering, oh, there was one thing that I wanted to bring up. So on page 141, we find Frank saying, our essential nature has certain attributes that are innate, meaning they already exist within each one of us, and we all have access to them. And one of those innate qualities is wisdom.
Mm.
And I want to say, I feel very cautious about that statement that he's saying right there. Like, for one, that phrase essential nature, that's a little tricky. Our essential nature is that there is no ground to stand on, that we are mere phenomena interacting with phenomena, coming and going, lots of empty space, little matter, little energy, like that. But to say that, and so do we have innate qualities that can be accessed? Well, certainly the Buddha said there are facets of the human experience that are accessible by everyone. That I would say is also true in terms of describing the way that the Buddha talked about the teaching and the practice. But to be careful with this idea, this idea that we're innately wise. I mean, one way I like to express it is, we are ourselves those principles that wise people understand. Do you know what I'm saying? We are that thing that we awaken to. We are an expression of those principles of reality that we are trying to awaken to, or that some folks have awakened to. So, does that mean we're wise? Well, maybe. The Buddha also said, does the spoon taste the soup? Not really.
It's a good one.
The spoon does not taste the soup. So I guess I'm throwing some various metaphors at you in an attempt to disabuse you of any kind of essentialist notion about wisdom or about human existence whatsoever.
Interesting that one of the psychotherapy trainings I did was called Hakomi. It's one of the many body-centered psychotherapies. And actually, I'm not too sure if this is from Hakomi or from my teacher's elaboration of it into RCS, called Recreation of Self, which doesn't fit with Buddhism, but anyway.
Okay.
But the attitude that they taught us to hold was that the person we were working with knew what was right and true for them. And so our job was to be like the oil can or the grease can and just lubricate the process, but not to be the authority, you know, but just to sort of lubricate the process and have them go in. So it was basically going in and getting through all the habit energy or the defilements or the hindrances or whatever, and getting into this special place
Mm-hmm.
where they would know, you know. So anyway, so that, I guess you, I don't know if you'd want to call that some kind of a wisdom, but it's sort of a knowing what was really right and true for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is, I don't know that any of us could be on the path if there weren't some aspect of our hearts and minds that would gravitate toward reality, that would gravitate toward knowing the truth, knowing what's real. I guess, and when I'm hearing you express that, Sangamita, I'm thinking also of something like narrative therapy, you know, which is there's a woman here who's
It's quite different, because I've
different
studied
than
both. But
oh, okay.
quite different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just looking for that part of them which knows what's good for them.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, we're the only ones who are experiencing our inner world.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, sure. Each one of us is having an entirely different world experience, and how would anybody else be able to piece it all together properly?
Mm-hmm. I found it very respectful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Like the Japanese grammar, you know that in Japanese grammar, you cannot say, so-and-so feels that thing. You have to say, I think so-and-so feels that thing, or I believe, or maybe so-and-so feels that thing. You have to qualify it in a way that you can't actually just state outright somebody else's feeling. It's just grammatically wrong. And I always found that to be, again, a very kind of respectful way of saying, yeah.
So when you
So
talk
is that wisdom, though? Is that wisdom? It's wisdom if that person is able to go that next step from a simple kind of mundane health of body and mind into a deeper understanding of impermanent, right? The three seals. Impermanence,
yeah, it's probably not wisdom in the sort of the Buddhist sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something, Vanessa?
Yes, about the touching the groundlessness when it feels very scary, whether it's in meditation or triggered by the death of a loved one. It is a very deep way to, I think, what you said, learn, and one of the deepest teachings of impermanence, and that's what's real. And it, but when it gets really scary, like sometimes it gets too scary, and my mind gets with that. And I'm wondering, okay, yes, I want to learn from this, but it maybe sometimes I have to sleep. You know, I have to take some sleep because it makes me kind of panic almost sometimes. This.
Yes, right, and that doesn't help, right? That's not. Although terror is something that is often talked about on the path, in terms of us kind of facing very directly the pervasiveness of reality, the agitation that can come with fear or with seeing you know, touching into this very directly is not helpful and not something that you need to endure, right? It's something that you need to find some coping mechanisms for and get some support for, and yeah. So that is, I mean, that sounds to me like is a very compassionate way that you're approaching it for yourself, you know, seeing clearly what it is, and then seeing also the extent of the agitation and how that can be harmful if you're not able to get enough sleep, and you know, taking steps to really alleviate that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for sharing and so authentically. It's great. All right, folks, so we have arrived at our time. I'm always feeling like we could do twice as long, but we won't because we have other things to do too. So we'll go on. And so I want to say next week, so Sangamita, if you find that link for us of those talks by Bhante Sujato on metta, I would really like to listen to those.
I'll do that immediately.
Wonderful, wonderful. And 4 elements, we still didn't get there, Michaela, but at least Genku and Michaela, we did touch on your 2 topics that you requested for this week. So 4 elements are going to roll over again next week. And rollover minutes, somehow we'll get to them. And yes, please all be well, and we'll try to see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.